Hello, my name is Grace Shi, and I'm a partner with Mayor Brown and the practice lead for our global mobility practice here in Washington, D.C. I've spent most of my legal career in the field of global immigration with the opportunity to lead practices both in the United States and in Hong Kong. And I thought what better way to recognize Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month than by hearing from our guest speaker today, Ms. Connie Chung, who is joining us from Los Angeles. Connie is the Chief Executive Officer of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles, the nation's largest legal and civil rights organization for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Prior to joining Advancing Justice, Connie served as the Executive Director of Korean American Family Services, or KFAM, for 11 years. And prior to joining KFAM, she worked for 7 years as a civil rights litigator for Housing Rights Center in Los Angeles, representing clients in fair housing cases, and for the American Civil Liberties Union in Chicago, working on immigrants' rights, reproductive rights, post 9/11 racial profiling, police accountability, and First Amendment cases. Connie received her bachelor's degree from USC and her JD from Georgetown University Law Center, which is where we met. Thank you for joining us today, Connie.
Thanks, Grace, so much for having me. It's so great to be here with you.
We have an ambitious agenda for the next hour. We'll get to know Connie and how she's come to devote her life's work to the public interest, as you've just heard, the issues that she sees the Asian American community facing, and the steps that organizations like hers, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, are taking to address these issues, all as part of our effort to continue the dialogue on advancing racial equity in the United States. Connie, we met over 20 years ago in law school, and since graduation, you have dedicated your career to pursuing the public interest, civil rights, social justice. And I'm very proud to have you as my friend and to have been able to watch that journey. What set you on that path, and how have you stayed the course all these years?
So I went to college thinking that I was going to go into either international human rights or civil rights work. I knew that was my interest. And so I ended up going to law school because I thought it would be a good degree to have if I wanted to get into advocacy. And I knew I was never going to practice at a firm, but I thought that the law degree was a versatile enough degree that it would help me with doing advocacy. So I don't know that's the best reason to go to law school. You know, somebody also told me that going to law school means it defers reality for 3 years before you have to figure out what you want to do. And so that kind of just went to law school and decided I would figure out after that exactly what I wanted to do. And, you know, Grace, when we were in law school, of course, our third year of law school in DC is when 9/11 hit. And I still remember I was actually going to an interview at the State Department, and that happened. And I was like, okay, I'm not working at the State Department. And I ended up taking the job at the ACLU instead, because they were working on a really interesting post 9/11 racial and religious profiling case involving a Pakistani American woman who was an AmeriCorps volunteer who had been strip searched at O'Hare Airport because she wore a hijab. And so that's how I ended up doing ACLU. And I practiced as a civil rights lawyer for about 6 or 7 years. And after that, I have to say, I realized I didn't really like being a litigator. Like, I didn't really like suing people. I didn't really love the adversarial process, but I liked being in the public sector. I'll also say that after working in mainstream nonprofits for some time, what I realized was I really wanted to work within my own community. And I noticed as a Korean American, we never had Korean American or Asian American and Pacific Islander clients coming to my organization, whether that was at the ACLU or the Housing Rights Center. And the Housing Rights Center is in Koreatown in Los Angeles. But even still, even when there were bilingual staff, there were still too many cultural barriers that prevented our community members from feeling like these were places they would get help. So I ended up working for a culturally specific nonprofit called Korean American Family Services, working in mental health, domestic violence, and foster care. And when I was there, we started the first licensed foster family agency in the country for Asian Pacific Islander foster kids and foster families. And I actually, after 11 years, I loved my work there. I didn't have any intention of leaving. I would make jokes that I was a recovering attorney. But what happened was the pandemic hit, and I started to see Asian Americans being targeted and attacked. And it wasn't getting mainstream attention, but certainly if you followed Asian social media networks and if you were around, you knew about it. And we were starting to get blamed for COVID-19. And a couple of months later, it was then the murder of George Floyd. And through the Black Lives Matter movement, we had this public reckoning in our country around systemic racism and anti-Blackness in a way that I'd never seen before, certainly not when I was starting my career as a civil rights attorney. And I said to myself, you know, what we're living through right now with this pandemic is history. You know, all of my kids, my grandkids, future generations are going to learn about this moment in time in their US history books. And when they come back to me, when they get to that chapter in class and they ask, what was it like to live through the pandemic? You know, it was important for me to be able to say I was doing something as part of the solution, that I was contributing in some way. And so it was in that moment that I decided to switch back to the legal career and come to Advancing Justice LA. And, you know, Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA has been around since 1983, and we're the largest legal service and civil rights organization for the Asian Pacific Islander community. And I had actually heard about the organization back when I was in college this was the late 1990s. It was at the time called the Asian Pacific American Legal Center. And there was a case that was on the front page of the LA Times about 72 Thai nationals that had essentially been enslaved in garment workers in El Monte, California, which is a neighborhood in Los Angeles. And this organization had worked to get these Thai workers out of their situation and created a pathway for them to become US citizens, because at the time there were no immigration remedies if you were a human trafficking survivor, and also made sweeping changes to labor laws that still apply today. And Julie Su, who is now the Deputy Secretary of Labor, was our litigation director at that time. And it was one of those moments where I realized, oh my gosh, you can be Asian and be a civil rights attorney and work in nonprofit, because I had never met an Asian civil rights lawyer, let alone very many lawyers. I was definitely the first one in my family to ever go to law school. But that was a really kind of important moment to see that you could work in civil rights and be Asian American and do that. And so that's also part of why I came to this organization.
Thank you. I think we'll talk, I think that touches on many different points we'll address today, from representation to, and including representation. But I think we'll take that to sort of the next point you and I had prepared for, which is the discussion on the impact that the pandemic has had on the Asian American community. And you've introduced that. And I think something that you and I have discussed is how mainstream is the information? Is the information, the social media feeds, if you're following that type of news, if you have been since the beginning of the pandemic, because we are following, I personally don't have a good sense of whether it has made its way into the mainstream news, because I am flooded with that information. The more that I read about it, the more it floods my social media feeds and the information that is funneled to me. But you know, we can see many things that stem from that can date back to early 2020 at the start of the pandemic, and when we started to note the alarming rise in the number of hate crimes and hate incidents targeting the community. And we have things like hashtag Stop Asian Hate now. And we have organizations like Stop AAPI Hate, which is an anti-Asian hate reporting center, the fact that it gave rise to that type of organization. Can you speak a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the numbers?
Sure. So, since the pandemic began, there have been over 11,000 reported incidents of hate against the Asian American community, as reported by Stop AAPI Hate. But we also know that that is really just the tip of the iceberg. There are studies by Pew Research Center, Advancing Justice LA, we did one, and a couple other places where they've done community surveys of Asian Americans, and they've asked, during this pandemic, have you experienced any negative incident or reaction because of your race and ethnicity? And anywhere between 1/3 to 1/2 of Asian Americans in these surveys have said yes. So there are over 20 million Asian Americans in the United States. So you can do the math and realize that the numbers are woefully underreported. I do think we have some mainstream recognition now, and that aha moment was early on last year when we started to see, Asian seniors in the Bay Area being killed, and then certainly the Atlanta massacre was the big one for our country to finally realize, oh my gosh, something is going on here. And I think there was a slow recognition that this was happening, and it didn't get mainstream media attention until that moment, really, about a year ago. And I think that the reason there was a slow recognition was in part the model minority myth, right? People in this country have in their head that Asian Americans are successful and we're smart and we've assimilated so well in this country. And so the idea that Asian Americans face discrimination or oppression, it was really hard, I think, for the general American public to reconcile that. Now, the model minority myth is a term that's been around for many years. It was first coined in the 1960s by a white professor at UC Berkeley who wrote an article in the New York Times. And essentially what he said was Asian Americans are the model minority. They work hard and they assimilate and they don't cause trouble, and they end up being very successful in this country. The model minority myth has two key problems in my mind. Even though at first glance, I think a lot of people embraced it as, oh, this is a compliment to our community. But the first problem with it is it does obscure the true needs and challenges of the Asian American community. And that's why things like the, discrimination against our community was something that was really hard for Americans to reconcile for so long. Amongst all racial groups in this country, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders actually have the greatest disparity between the haves and the have-nots of any racial group. So, for example, the Pacific Islander community has the highest percentages of COVID-related hospitalizations and deaths of any group in this country. But people don't know that because they kind of get lumped in as Asian Pacific Islanders, and people just assume all of our community is doing really well, when actually there's huge socioeconomic challenges for that community. And it's not so surprising to think that there's so much disparity when you think about the diversity of our community. Not only
I think that's something, if you could also specifically address that, because I know that when I first broached the subject with peers and colleagues about promoting different events for Heritage Month and what does it mean to be Asian American, now Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, you have South Asians, Southeast Asians. It's a large community and it is very diverse. In some ways, the diversity is different from what you would see in other groups.
Yeah, I mean, we speak more than 40 different languages within our API communities. So there's a huge diversity there, religions, different groups, but also different immigration history of how we came to this country. So it's not a huge surprise that you think that there is a lot of diversity and disparity in our community when you think about our immigration patterns. My parents are Korean American. They came here in the 1970s with the wave of other Korean Americans because they had a medical degree. And so the US opened its doors to Korean Americans and said, you come here, we welcome you to our country if you have a medical degree, or if you have an engineering degree, we will give you a visa. It's a very different experience than when America opened its doors to people in Vietnam and Cambodia because of civil war that was happening there. And they said, we will let you come here as refugees. So there's different immigration experiences for different ethnic groups in this country. And so you end up having different disparities and challenges based on how you come. It's very different if you as a community came here under a refugee status than if you came here with a medical degree. But so we really push for understanding the differences in our community, and we push for disaggregated data or data equity, because if you don't understand the community and the distinct needs of different groups, it's really hard to provide the right policies and services. But so going back, so the first issue with the model minority myth is it obscures the true needs and challenges of some of our community members, especially groups that are most vulnerable, and there are quite a few vulnerable groups we have. The second problem with the model minority myth, it's been used actually to create a pitting of communities of color against each other. So when you took that argument of Asian Americans, you are so successful and you're doing well, and you are assimilating so well in this country, what was underlying that message was, so what's wrong with you, other communities of color, particularly the Black community? Why aren't you able to lift yourself up by the bootstraps the way the Asian American community has done? And so what it's created is it's created this hierarchy of racism where communities of color are sort of treated differently. But in actuality, if you're a community of color, you are being discriminated against in some way or another. So what happens is we end up fighting within one another for resources and attention. And you see the structure doing that. But all of us, as long as we're fighting amongst each other, saying, hey, I'm more oppressed or I deserve these resources, what ends up happening, it only perpetuates a system that keeps us all down. And so there's been really more movement to talk about what does interracial solidarity look like, because we need to break out of that mold. But Grace, going back to your question about what we're seeing in this pandemic, I will say that early on, when the pandemic first hit, it did not help that we had certain elected officials and other prominent people who would refer to COVID-19 as the China virus and the Wuhan virus and Kung flu. And when you use those kinds of labels, it essentially put a bullseye on the back of all Asian Americans for what was an incredibly emotionally charged time for our country. And it gave people an outlet to blame Asian Americans. But I think it's important to understand that there's a historical context for this as well. That in American history, you see over and over again that when America feels threatened, whether by disease, foreign powers, economic competitors, that often Asian Americans are being the ones scapegoated and blamed. And it's because we are not seen as American enough in this country. There is something called the perpetual foreigner myth or the yellow peril myth. And it is this view that Asian Americans are not truly American. And there was a recent report that was just put out by the Asian American Foundation 2 weeks ago, their status index. And they do a survey of Americans and their viewpoints on Asian Americans. And in their survey, they found that between last year and this year, there's an increased feeling in America that Asian Americans are not loyal to this country. So there is a heightened feeling that we are foreigners. I mean, it's why someone like my father-in-law, who is a US born American citizen, Vietnam War veteran, who's been decorated for his service to this country, when he was walking down the street in Alhambra, California, early on in the pandemic to walk his dog, he was called a racial slur, and it's because he is of Chinese descent. And so when you look at the history, what you see is 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And, even before that, you had things like the Page Act that banned Asians from coming to this country. When you look at World War II and the incarceration of over 100,000 Japanese Americans in concentration camps. When you look at 1982, the killing of Vincent Chin by 2 white auto workers who blamed the Japanese automobile industry for the economic demise that was happening in Detroit, Michigan. When you look at the racial profiling of South Asians after 9/11, as well as Muslims, Arabs, and Middle Easterners. And then when you look at what's happening today, you see this pattern occurring that when America feels threatened, often Asian Americans are to be blamed. And that's why there's also this push to really teach American history differently and to understand this pattern. Because if we don't understand that pattern and what's happening, it's really hard to think that we can stop it from happening again in the future if you're not aware of it.
So if we've seen these historical patterns, what type of change, truly effective change, could take place now? Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing? Whether it's us, the community, actions the community is taking, actions your organization is taking, actions our elected officials are taking. Because if you look at these different patterns that you've just identified, but we're at a point in time in history, you just said this will be written about in the history books. Surely now is the time where true change can be achieved. What are you seeing?
Sure. So I think with elected officials and policymakers, some of the things we're seeing include, you're seeing a wave of Asian American studies and ethnic studies being pushed all over the country. So Illinois passed the Teach Act, which was the first law to mandate Asian American studies be taught at the K through 12 education system. In California, we have a law that now says that as a high school graduation requirement, you must have taken an ethnic studies course and fulfilled that requirement to graduate from high school. And you see different laws in places like New Jersey and other states really pushing for Asian American curriculum to be added. I will also say
that at the high school level. Did you say high school?
In K through 12, I will say,
Oh.
and a lot of it's in a K through 12. It's to add Asian American curriculum into the American curriculum, the school curriculum system. So a lot of states they're the ones who decide what goes into the curriculum of schools, they're adding Asian American studies and things more about like some of the historical moments I talked about are being incorporated, or that's what the push is for. I will also say that we're seeing laws like the federal hate crimes legislation that was passed last year. There's a bill like that in California, and there's bills all over the state, or laws being passed all over the state, to say a few things. One is we need to recognize that in response to anti-Asian hate and things like Atlanta, we need better training to law enforcement on how to recognize hate crimes and how to better report on it, because we also know that underreporting, part of it is that some law enforcement, they don't recognize something as a hate crime, and so then, or hate incident, and so it doesn't get reported as such. We also realize that Asian American nonprofits and services have been woefully underfunded in this country. And part of that is the model minority myth. People just assume that there are no needs in the Asian American community. And so services, by whether it's federal level, state level, or philanthropy, it's really underfunded for things like Asian language mental health services, or senior services. And so you're seeing an infusion of funding to support API organizations and communities to make sure they get the services they need. You're also seeing more things like helplines and making sure that those are provided in language. So that way folks can report what they're seeing and ask for help in their own languages, because that is one of the huge barriers, right? If you can't speak English well and you need to report, you're not going to report it to a group if you can't communicate with them. So we're seeing at the elected level, we're seeing some of that. At the community level, what we're seeing is a push for things like community-based safety interventions. So at our organization, Advancing Justice LA, we do run bystander intervention trainings, which teach folks through like a 1-hour Zoom class some tools they can have should they witness an Asian American being harassed. So if you see that happening, most people think, okay, I either have to stop the person and put myself in harm's way, or I just need to ignore it to keep myself safe. Well, we teach what's called the 5 Ds, which are different interventions that you can do to either support the victim after the fact, or at the moment, do something to intervene to help support the victim. So you're seeing programs like that. You're seeing restorative justice programs. You're seeing anti-bullying programs at schools, a lot of those kinds of community programs. And then I think what we're seeing also at more of the, I would say, individual level, is that we're seeing folks saying, we need to focus on racial equity, and we need to focus that as a priority in this country. And that needs to be focused for all communities of color. We need to think about how we support the Black community and Black Lives Matter. We need to think about the Latinx community, the API community, and we need to be more sophisticated in how we address these problems. I will say historically in America, race discussions have not been really framed in a very sophisticated, nuanced way. You know, growing up, I learned about the 1960s civil rights era. I learned, you know, Black people were slaves, then they were, they had to deal with segregation, and now things are all better. And that was kind of the, you know, very simplistic way of how I felt like I was educated. So things were so we learned things in a, what I would say was a Black-white binary. We didn't really have enhanced discussions around other groups and other communities of color and how they play into race discussions. We didn't have discussions around things like intersections of not only race, but being LGBTQ or being a woman and how that plays into things. And so I think there is more of an interest now in thinking about these different issues and these different communities, how they align and how they come together, and how we need to create systems that kind of address all of them as opposed to just one of them. And I will say that I think in the private sector and companies, folks are waking up to the fact that diversity, equity, and inclusion is really important to all of us. And you can't say that's not part of my business, so I'm going to keep that separate from my work. And I think that's been actually a huge shift. I mean, Grace, think about it. When we were coming out of law school, what employer was having these kinds of discussions? No one was talking this way. You know, I worked at the ACLU and we weren't having forums like this, right? It was not, people weren't talking about why is diversity and equity important to me in my workplace. We weren't given permission to bring our racial identity into the workplace. And so that has been a really profound shift. Having groups like this, we see, you know, affinity groups now and people coming into spaces, and having firms and companies say, I recognize you for your race or your gender or whatever other, you know, identity you have, and I want to create a safe space for that, and I want to acknowledge it. And so a lot of companies, I really encourage supervisors and colleagues to remember that you can reach out to your peers after an incident like Atlanta or what happened in Buffalo, and to go up to somebody or reach out and say, hey, I'm really sorry about what happened this weekend. That is just terrible. And I just want you to know that I'm here to support you, or I stand in solidarity with you. And those kinds of statements made by your peers in your workplace or just wherever your spheres of influence may be are actually really profound. But it's those kinds of little steps that I think are really important to create an environment where everyone feels like racial equity and my identity as, you know, an Asian woman of color or something like that is important, and that I'm feeling recognized. And I think we're seeing that more and more nowadays.
Can you speak a little bit about how the mass murders in Atlanta last year, I think it was March of 2021, how that was or was not, I would call it a turning page, but maybe you wouldn't characterize it as such, but you've mentioned it a couple of times today, and it comes up in conversation. And part of the reason I bring this up, you've just mentioned, you know, when we started out in our careers, this is not the type of conversation that we would have held. And in preparing for today's session, you and I had talked about that you and I have never sat down one-on-one to have this type of, I don't know if you call it a sobering conversation, but on this topic specifically in just this way. But here at Mayor Brown, last year in the spring, a group of the Asian American attorneys got together, and I can't remember how we were brought together, but somebody brought us together. And it was last year in the spring before we were back to the office. It was a virtual get together, and it was after the Atlanta shootings. And it was just a cathartic get together where everyone just talked about how they were doing. And I think for each one of us, I've shared this with you before, it was an unexpected outpouring of being asked the simple question of how are you doing? And that we all knew that it turned on this one event. and perhaps without much prior introspection as to what we were consciously thinking about and feeling the reactions to the event, being brought together in that type of safe space you just referred to, brought something out. And it was last year that we got together and we decided, let's put on more events. Let's talk about this more. Let's put this out in the open so that everyone becomes more comfortable discussing, whether it's on peripheral topics or on the topic at hand. Can you speak a little bit about what you've seen as the turning point, or based on the events of last year?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think particularly Atlanta, but so much of the violence that we started to really start hearing about more at the beginning of last year, it was a pivotal moment. What I've heard so many Asian Americans say, especially at that time when the violence seemed so palpable for Asian Americans, and I will say in particular for Asian American women after Atlanta, and knowing, mind you, that of the 11,000 reported incidents, Asian American women are targeted 2 to 3 times more than Asian American men. There was this feeling of incredible anxiety and fear, and sadness, right? It was for those lives that were lost. A lot of us were freaking out about our parents. We were telling our parents, don't go outside because you could be attacked. Don't go to your daily walks in the park. I mean, it was craziness that we felt like that. And I was speaking to a lot of Asian Americans who were saying, I'm scared to go back to work. I'm scared to going back to school. I'm more scared about being attacked in my neighborhood than I am of catching COVID-19. And, this was before everyone was vaccinated. And I remember thinking, as an Asian Americans, we're more scared about our fellow Americans as we walk down the street to go to the supermarket than we are with a virus that at that point had taken the lives of 600,000 people in this country. And I was like, what is happening? And that is a very emotionally personal thing for everyone who was going through that. And I think that's why it was important for those who are not Asian American to realize that even if I don't know anyone in Atlanta, or I don't know any of the victims directly, just by my identity as being an Asian American, especially as an Asian American woman, that could be me, because it's just because what I look like that folks are getting targeted. It's just because their identity. So there's nothing that I could personally do to change that fact. So that's why these hate incidents and hate crimes feel so personal. It's because it's based on something that we can't change about ourselves or change the way we look. And so I think for a lot of companies, they were creating those safe spaces, and Asian American employees were coming together and talking amongst themselves. And they were, for the first time, also hearing companies saying, I want to make sure you feel safe and supported. And we want to have an environment to talk about how we can be allies or show solidarity or talk about race and anti-Asian hate. And it's been profound, right? And I don't think there's it's not going back. Now that we've prioritized diversity.
Think so? Sometimes I wonder.
I should say it's not that it's not going back. I don't think it should, and I don't think it can go back. I do wonder too. So one of the things and the challenges that we see in the Asian American social justice movement is this concern that as the headlines are not showing it as much anymore, and when the headlines go away and the news media is moving on to the next subject,
we forget very quickly. And I think we saw that a lot, after George Floyd's murder and Black Lives Matter movement. People were really public about it, but I've spoken to Black organizations who said our funding went down. It was an outpouring that first year, and then people are starting to forget and they move on, and then the funding goes down, the interest and the focus and the speaking, the spaces like this go down. So it is important to continue to push this and to remind companies that this continues to be an important issue for our employees,
for our clients, for us. It's important to continue focusing on this. I do think we have DEI programs and chief diversity officers and DEI managers in a way that was not institutionalized 10 years ago. So I don't think it's going to be completely backsliding. I do think that we now have some infrastructure in place to enhance promoting and supporting employees of color and communities of color and racial justice. But I do think that you're right that it could backslide to some extent if we don't continue to say this is a priority. And I just want to say, Grace, I just want to say, I think it's fantastic that your Asian American employees in your firm came together that way and you created that space for yourselves. And hopefully it doesn't take a massacre like Atlanta for you to continue to have those spaces, to continue to come together and talk. I mean, I understand it's most important. You feel the need for it the most after a moment like that, when there's such profound sadness and fear. But it's important to continue to have a safe space for Asian American employees to feel like we can come together and talk about things. There are things unique to being an Asian American attorney working in big law, trying to make it in this world. And I'm sure you see it all the time. And when you talk to, I'm sure, other Asian American associates, there's a lot they can learn from you, from that unique experience. And I think that's true for other communities of color, that there's some unique learnings and challenges and experiences that you're going to have. And to be able to navigate that, you need that safe space for your other colleagues.
I do want to get to the point of representation because it goes straight to that. But I did want to address one question that just came in through the Q&A. What are some ways we can help prevent Asian Americans and other minorities getting blamed for negative events that occur in this country? Big question. But
yeah, so a couple things. First thing is, I really think we all need to learn our history. Most of us got a very poor, I think we got poor training and education on these kinds of communities of color and ethnic studies. So we need to do extra homework to learn it. And I'll throw in the chat box in a second, Asian American Education Project, which is a great website that teaches different curriculum on Asian American history. I would also encourage you to look at, there's a TV series called the PBS Asian American series that was like a 5-hour special on PBS that they're showing in May for free. And I think it's an excellent way to get a little bit of a lesson. And then I make sure that with my kids, I am teaching them a little bit more than what they're getting at school. I think it's important for all of us to get that education, not just for Asian American studies, but we got to push that for Black studies, Latinx studies, Indigenous studies. We need to push our curriculum to be more inclusive at all levels. And, I do that as a parent in my kids' PTA group. You can do that. I hear a lot of college students and professors doing that in higher ed and institutions, and really in forcing education and awareness to be integrated. I think the other thing that we need to be doing to show solidarity, it's the little things, right? I think sometimes folks think it's up to the politicians to create the laws. So it's up to, the police or law enforcement to address the criminal justice system and things like that. I disagree. Yes, those people have a role, but really it is what you are able to do and control within your sphere of influence, within your environment, that is so important, right? It's for a lot of us as Asian Americans, I'm less worried that I'm going to be attacked in a Atlanta type of situation, but far more worried that I'm going to be walking to the park with my 2 daughters and somebody is going to say something, they say to them, go back to your country, or call them a chink. And my 9-year-old is going to ask me what that is.
Yes, that is what I'm bracing myself for. That's right.
And that is real. And I've had that happen to friends in my neighborhood. And I live in South Pasadena, which is a very large Asian population. And it's a very, I like to think of a safe, progressive town, but it is a real, no matter where you are from, right? And what I need to know is that should that happen, that people at the park around me and other parents and folks would have my back, and that they would say that was terrible and are you okay, and come and show me and my kids that that is an outlier, and that overall people are going to be coming and showing their allyship and support. Those are the real life, more realistic and more common examples of I think what anti-Asian hate and what solidarity looks like. So I think folks should really think about locally what they can do, even little things like learning different microaggressions, what they are, and how to avoid doing that. I was at an event yesterday where a very prominent law partner, not from Mayor Brown, but another firm, asked my Asian colleague, "Where are you from?" She's born and raised in the United States. And so she said, "Oh, I'm from LA." And he said, "No, where are your parents from?" The question he wants to ask is, what's your ethnicity, right? He wanted to know that she was of Chinese descent. That question right there is asked all the time to Asian Americans, probably all the time to a lot of Latinx friends I have. It is not asked to folks of European descent nearly as much. And that's just a small example of a microaggression. People think, why is that a big deal to ask, where are you from? The reason it's a big deal is because what's underlying that question of where are you from is sort of like, where are you not from? You're not from here. And when you think about, when I was talking about the history and the context of how Asians have been treated as the forever foreigner, and how at its worst case, you have the levels of violence that we see with hate crimes and attacks happening on our community. That's why we're sensitive to that question of where are we from. If you want to ask, where am I from? And you mean, are you from LA? That's appropriate. And I, even with that question, I always say, I would ask, where are you from? Are you from LA? Because I want to make sure the person understands I'm actually asking you as a person, which neighborhood are you from or which location? If I want to ask what their race or ethnicity is, I don't ask an Asian American, where are you from? I ask them, what's your ethnicity?
Let's get to that topic of representation, because we have another question. I think that before we get to that question in the Q&A, we talk a little bit about representation. Because I think to bring context to this, you and I grew up in LA. We've talked a little bit about that. And you and I are both parents. And we've acknowledged that even having grown up in what I would consider racially diverse and culturally diverse LA, and LA, recognize LA is comprised of many, many suburbs and cities, but at that time, we didn't see ourselves represented in TV and in the movies, the mainstream television, mainstream media, in the way that we see it now. And I am personally gratified, just including as a parent, to see that my kid will grow up seeing at least one Asian American superhero in the Marvel movies. Maybe there are going to be many more, but I'm gratified by just seeing the one. That there's a Pixar movie, that recent Pixar movie, telling the story of a Chinese Canadian and her particular heritage. And despite all the different reviews and the controversies it's engendered, at least the point is the representation and that the story is being told. And we have so many more Asian actors and musicians and comedians in the mainstream. It's not just the one. And so some of these questions go to, and sort of recognizing that there is more than the one at your place of work that you read about in the news. Can you speak a little bit about that in terms of, is there a sea change? Is it still incremental? What can employers, companies, and I'm not just speaking of the law firm context, what do you see as being a shift, a move in the right direction?
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen a move in the right direction, but it's been so bad historically of Asian American representation that even still we have so much farther to go. So my maiden name was Connie Chung, and my parents literally named me after the newscaster Connie Chung, because she was the only Asian American they saw on TV. And my parents like, our last name's Chung. Look, there's her. She was the one and only. I could tell you that I could start a support group for all of the Connie Chungs that were born, in like the late 70s, early 80s, because all of us, our parents like saw that one person, and that was it at the time, right? There were no Asian Americans on TV. It's better. There's still very, very little representation of Asian Americans in TV and film. True for other communities of color, true for, female representation. We know the numbers are still so low, but we are seeing things get better, right? So there was that Asian American Foundation Status Index I mentioned. One of the questions they ask Americans is, can you name an Asian American, like a prominent Asian American? And more than half of the folks that they surveyed said they could not. And then the top two that were named are Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan. Now, Jackie Chan is not Asian American. He is from overseas in Asia, and Bruce Lee's dead. They couldn't name Kamala Harris, like they couldn't name any prominent Asian Americans. I mean, how sad is that? That is the state of our representation still, certainly in entertainment and the media and mainstream. Although I do think that we've seen some really great improvements, right? I mean, I was on Netflix the other day, and now they have a whole section for API Heritage Month. And so they have Asian Pacific Islander films as one of the categories and shows. And I was like, oh my God, there was nothing like that ever before last year, really. That never happened like that. So there's definitely improvements, but I do see there's so many areas we still need to go. One is certainly with our elected officials, there is still not enough Asian American or Pacific Islander representation in our government. And those are the folks that make the laws, right? I mean, they're the ones who make the major policies. It upsets me to no end that there is not a single Asian American woman in the California State Assembly or Senate. And there has in California, which is, one of the largest Asian American populations in the country, right? It's more than, I think in the state, it's more than 12% Asian Pacific Islander. And there's not a single woman for 6 years, not since Carol Liu retired. And I think when we're seeing this escalation in anti-Asian hate, when we know Asian American women are being targeted 2 to 3 times more than men, I want to know that there are folks representing me, creating laws that are going to be protecting folks like me. And if there's no Asian American women, there's no representation for that voice and that lived experience in the state capitol. That's a problem, right? So we need more Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and more communities of color, people of color in general, in elected office. We really need to diversify that. What I see in things like the private sector and different companies and firms, there's sometimes representation getting your foot in the door, but when it comes to promotional opportunities and really being at positions of power, there's also a major problem there, that there is not enough representation. I can tell you on the philanthropic boards in around the country, there's one study that says amongst the major boards, the Asian representation was something like 2% of these major boards had Asian Americans on it. 2%. I mean, it's next to nothing. And I think we certainly see that in the legal field, that you have folks coming into the door, but how many folks are, yes, from law school or, as associates, young associates, you have a better level of representation. But as you move up, to partner and then at the higher levels, that the number or the diversity starts to get less and less in those higher positions of power. And so I think a lot of companies are thinking about that right now. What are our benchmarks to measure diversity, not just at the entry level or the total company, but at management and senior management and at our board and at our executive levels, how are we going to create an environment where folks feel like this is a place they want to stay for the long haul and to get into those and to get promoted into those positions of power? And how do we create policies that increase the diversity and enhance that? And how are we going to benchmark and measure that that's happening over the long haul? So all of those levels of representation, I think people are now realizing in a bigger way that that's a problem and that needs to happen. And we're starting to see a lot more companies and groups starting to look for those kinds of things. And that's why so many companies now have DEI officers, or they're strengthening that department in a way that maybe they didn't invest in it in quite the same way in past years.
We just here at Mayor Brown started our summer associate program. So it's very top of mind, I think, for many law firms and also just companies that have summer hiring programs where there are active, conscious efforts to not only open the doors, to always have a diverse slate, but to create the opportunities to attract and then to really engage and to retain. And we have a question in the Q&A. Are there any specific steps that you would recommend for law firms specifically? But you could speak at a broader level as well. Steps to be taken to increase or to improve the hiring and retention rates for Asian Americans specifically.
Yeah, I was just at an event yesterday where this topic came up, and there were some younger associates from who had been part of a program where the law firm purposely brought folks who were from communities of color and maybe had less opportunities to go to law school. So it was a lot of first generation lawyers, and created a space for them. And they had a program where they would meet regularly in a cohort. And there was more senior level partners and lawyers who were also people of color who were mentoring them, and created a space where they could all talk and they could all, I think they would have technical discussions about things like, how to interview better, things to navigate. But a lot of it was also, I think, they created a space where folks felt like, I don't feel like I have to have people recognize imposter syndrome. Like, I feel like I don't belong here, because that's what I think a lot of folks, if you're from a marginalized community, or if you don't see folks who look like you at the table, or you see them as partners, you need to have assurance that like you belong. And that's hard if you don't see enough partners, or you don't see enough folks at the higher level who look like you don't feel like you belong. And so having a safe space, like bringing together maybe your summer associates of color, or particularly having a program to look for folks who might have more different lived experience and might not traditionally be coming into the legal field, creating a structured space for them that also includes higher level partners or attorneys who can say, like, I'm here and I did it and you can too, and giving them that reinforcement, I think, is really important. I mean, Grace, you and I both come from Asian immigrant households where our parents weren't lawyers. None of our relatives were lawyers. I never went through
the families. Yeah.
I mean, I remember the first time I went to a country club and I was like really nervous, and I was probably 28. I wasn't that young. And I saw all of these white people and they seemed super comfortable. And like, I didn't understand when there was like a receipt, and I thought I had to pull out my credit card, and somebody said to me, well, you don't pay. It's at the country club. And they giggled. And I was humiliated. I was so embarrassed that I didn't know this, but my parents never had a membership to a country club. I'd never been to one before. Those are moments of embarrassment that I think if you are not used to that, and I mean, I know it sounds like a silly example, but there are thousands of those examples that if you are not growing up in an environment where you had those opportunities, you feel like you feel out of place, you feel like an imposter, and you need to be reminded that it's okay. You bring other things to the table. It took me a really long time to be comfortable going into environments where it's more of a, like, especially if it's a more of a private corporate setting. When I see a room and there are not very many women of color, I always felt like there's something wrong with me, that I can't connect to the older men in this room, and I don't have the same connection. I tend to gravitate towards other women of color. I just feel more comfortable. And I used to think that's because there's something deficient in me, that I can't do that. And I think what we need to reinforce to younger, especially summer associates of color and younger attorneys of color is, no, you bring something really special to the table because you are different. As a woman of color, as an Asian American woman, as a child of immigrants, I bring some richness and difference and a different lived experience when I go into those rooms. And instead of seeing that as a weakness, I have to challenge myself and say, that is my benefit. That is a benefit to this room, that they have me here and that I can bring that in. And that's hard to do if you don't have the confidence. And so I think that's when it's really important to remind your summer associates and to your younger attorneys, that is your value, that you are different and you are unique. And we want you to feel safe here. And so we want to surround you by other colleagues who look and have similar experiences as you, but we also want you to know as a firm that we value that about you.
Thank you, Connie. I think we're running at the top of the hour, but I will take this last question because it was one of the earlier questions that I had hoped we could get to. It segues a bit from what you just discussed. And the question is, how can we best challenge a lot of internalized anti-Asian sentiment within our own community? And I think there is a natural bridge to this question from what you've just commented on in terms of representation and being able to see that, to recognize, and sometimes it takes time, the value that the differences can bring in these types of settings.
Yeah. So I think we all internalize certain cultural values that we're growing up with. We grow up in a culture that whether we like it or not, communities of color have not been treated as well. And in this racial hierarchy, that as communities of color, we weren't given the same values as if you were not. So we need to, and I think as Asian Americans, we often have internalized that model minority myth, that we've said, we work hard, we're smart, we go to good school, and that's good, that we just need to make it for ourselves. And we need to put our heads down, do well, and be economically and financially successful. And that's all we need to care about. And I think what we've seen in the last couple of years has turned that on its head. And it's been a wake-up call to many Asian Americans that it's not enough financially successful in this country. You can be a lawyer, you can be a doctor, and you're still being attacked and you're still being told to go back to the country. And so we need to recognize that we have a further duty to unpack that and to recognize the challenges and the stereotypes that are not beneficial to us, and also recognize that we need to move beyond just the Asian American community. I think communities of color, sometimes we do that. We're like, I care about my community and I just want what's best for me and my family and my community. And I think it's really important in this moment to say, what does multiracial solidarity look like? And it's important for me to break out of my comfort zone and really reach out to other communities of color and to my colleagues from other communities of color, and to say, like, we need to do more together, and I need to show my solidarity to you. For me, it's not just there's both the racial, there's both the moral imperative for racial equity in my mind, that we need to all be working together and lift each other up. But even from just a purely strategic standpoint, if we continue to be pitted against each other for resources and attention. And we continue to fight for that within one another. We're not addressing a larger system, right? So the example of this is after George Floyd's murder, we saw a lot of companies investing in racial justice. And I saw a lot of money and grants being poured out for racial justice. And running an Asian nonprofit, when I would ask about that and say I run an Asian civil rights organization, I basically had doors closed to me. What I was, what was underlying was this message that this money is not for you. We're committed to the Black and brown communities. And that was difficult to hear. And I think after Atlanta and what happened last year, there was a wake-up call. Oh, Asian Americans face discrimination too. We probably need to include them when we talk about racial justice. And so we were included in more grants. What was challenging is in some ways, it was sometimes like the same amount of funding and diversity. And it was just that, okay, we're going to take
everyone getting a smaller slice of the pie then.
Yeah, it was like, I'll take away from this community and I'll give to another. And that is when you start pitting communities of color against each other, right? Because then folks are saying, well, why are you taking away my money and giving it to them? I'm more oppressed or I have more issues. And we can't do that to one another. What we need to do is go back to the institutions and say, no, you need to invest more money and more resources to support all of us. And so we started to see that, like Bank of America, who's one of our funders, they had a 4-year $1 billion racial justice program after George Floyd. And after Atlanta, they said, we're going to give you money. And we just want to announce that we're changing it to a 5-year, $1.25 billion grant, program. And so I told the CEO, I was like, that was good. You didn't play this zero-sum game and say, I'm going to take money from one community, give to another. You enlarged the pot in order to make sure to make room for other communities of color, but not at the expense of another community. And so that's the challenge, right? It's that Asian American violence is gonna, at some point, we're not gonna be in the headlines, and there's another community that's gonna be targeted more. And when that happens, the goal is for the institution not to say, okay, we're gonna forget about this group and we're gonna move on to the next group, but instead to expand the pie, to continue to promote and build space for more communities, because that's the only way to fight that pitting of communities of color against each other.
Well, thank you, Connie. I want to read the last question, which is more of a comment to close out our session. This comment, as an African-American, attending the session was affirming, informative, insightful, and generally a good thing. More non-Asians should attend these sessions. Connie Jo did a great job speaking, giving voice to the issues, and sharing perspective. I am so glad I attended this session. And I want to say thanks again, Connie, for making the time today in your early morning in Los Angeles to join us today.
Oh, Grace, well, it was my pleasure. And I'd do anything for you. So.
All right, for all of our attendees, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thanks.